This is Upfront and Outspoken. Here's your host, Bob Williams.
Some folks are born made to wave the flag. Ooh, they're red, white, and
blue. And welcome back. This is Upfront Outspoken. Of course, I'm your host, Bob Williams, with you here on this Thursday morning. What can I tell you? It's been a very, very interesting past 24 hours. And I have quickly assembled a group of panelists. You all know him, author, activist Jonathan Wolfman, and also author from Spain, Arjuna Krishna-das, will be joining me shortly. We're going to be talking about the recent events that has occurred between the Cuban and American relations. Yes, since Alan Gross has been released, things have been going in an uphill battle on some fronts, while on others they are totally ecstatic. But before I bring them on, I have a short 2.5-minute clip I want you all to hear.
Cuban relations more than this. The historic phone call between President Obama and Cuban leader Raul Castro.
The Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
The first presidential level engagement, the White House says, since the Cuban Revolution more than 50 years ago.
We will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries.
Senior administration officials say the secret U.S.-Cuba talks started in June 2013, with most of the discussions happening in Canada and led by Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes. Those wheels were in motion when the president and Raul Castro shook hands at Nelson Mandela's memorial service last December. But one key sticking point remained: the imprisonment of Alan Gross in Cuba.
A major obstacle stood in our way: the wrongful imprisonment in Cuba of a U.S. citizen and USAID subcontractor, Alan Gross, for 5 years.
Last March, President Obama found a pivotal player to help broker the deal, Pope Francis. They discussed Cuba at the Vatican, something Mr. Obama did not disclose when asked by CNN. And what were his concerns?
In terms of the meeting with His Holiness Pope Francis, we had a wide-ranging discussion.
Earlier this year, the Pope kept the conversation going, sending letters to President Obama and Raul Castro. Then in October, the Vatican welcomed officials from the U.S. and Cuba to push the talks forward.
I want to thank and recognize the support of the Vatican.
The president had the bipartisan support of Senators Patrick Leahy and Jeff Flake and Congressman Chris Van Hollen, who flew to Cuba to bring Gross home. But Cuban-American leaders in Congress are fiercely opposed to the White House deal, from the outgoing Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Bob Menendez to Senator Marco Rubio, two backers of the U.S. embargo on Cuba.
This policy contradiction is absurd, and it is disgraceful for a president who claims to treasure human rights and human freedom. This president is the single worst negotiator we have had in the White House in my lifetime.
Mr. Obama has changed his position on the embargo over the years, from his days as a state senator
I think it's time for us to end the embargo on Cuba.
to a candidate for president.
I will maintain the embargo.
But in his final years in office, the president wants to turn the page.
But today we are making these changes because it is the right thing to do.
All right. At this point, I want to bring in my guest, Jonathan Wolfman, who is in Bethesda, Maryland, and Arjuna Krishna-das, who is in Spain. Once again, gentlemen, welcome to the program. Glad to have you.
Oh, good.
Hello there.
Good to be with you all.
Now, Arjuna, I'm going to start with you this morning right off the bat. You have heard through your news media sources that this is a historical event that is occurring between Cuba and the United States. You know, we've had this embargo for over 60 plus years. How are people that you know of and the news agencies over there in Europe taking to what occurred yesterday?
I think people are generally very appreciative for. It's seen as somewhat of an anachronism. This animosity has gone on for so long. When the last real, any kind of real serious warfare between the United States and its Russian proxy Cuba, or Russia's proxy Cuba, occurred in the early 60s, just before I was born. And so it's not even within my lifetime that this aggression has been so bad. So I think people are generally pretty appreciative. Cuba used to be a Spanish colony. It was the penultimate colony. After Cuba gained its independence in around 1900, the Spanish also, after that, gave up the Sahara. But it was the penultimate Spanish colony, which is interesting as well from this part of the world.
Now, Jonathan, you and I both were born and were raised during the very initial start of this embargo. You know, from our perspective, but I know I'm going to give mine here, but I want to get yours. How do you feel about this sudden change that when we were kids, this embargo, this had been initiated, and now suddenly in our lifetime, we have a complete turnaround?
I have a lot to say about this. First, I want to say that the congressman who flew down to get the American...
Arjuna, you're going to have to turn your volume down over there.
The congressman who flew down to get Alan Gross is my congressman, Chris Holland, here in southern Maryland, and I am proud as punch to be his constituent. Secondly, I would just like to say, you know, it's very likely we lost one of the finest presidents of the United States, John F. Kennedy, because of the thinking a little more radicalized that you heard Marco Rubio talking about yesterday. If it wasn't a combination of radical anti-Castro Cubans and the mafia who killed Kennedy, then the Bobbsey twins killed Kennedy.
Well, before we go on, we're getting somebody's got the speaker up, and we're getting some severe feedback here, and it's kind of overriding everybody. Okay, that's whatever it was, whoever it was, that was better. Now, Jonathan, go ahead and finish what you were saying. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no, not at all. So first of all, I think that if we want to stay in a world in which the mafia can dictate things to kill presidents of the United States, as they almost certainly did with Kennedy, then fine. Go along with Marco Rubio's, 19th century old Cold War. The Republican Party it wants to fight the Cold War on and on and on because they have no new ideas. These are the same people whose president, Richard Nixon, opened the door to the largest communist country in the world, China. I taught in China 10 or 12 years after that was opened. It was the right thing to do. This is the right thing to do. The reason the Chinese communists have in fact turned to their extent more toward a Western way of looking at things is precisely because, even as a Republican, and he got hell for it from the very far right, because Nixon figured it out that the way to get these people into the 21st century, or at that time, of course, the 20th century, is to have an active, critical, but an active engagement. What do people like Rubio want? To just keep pumping their chests? And what does he want to do? Do another Bay of Pigs? Fine, he can go to the beaches and get killed.
Well, the thing was, you brought up a very interesting point about the GOP. And a recent survey showed that 78% of the Cuban population in Miami, and which is why everybody says, watch Florida, watch Florida. The 78% of the Cuban population there did indeed vote in favor of President Bush. And the thing is, we are getting mixed signals from that community. Of course, you got Marco Rubio, but you have other civic leaders from those that were involved in a 1996 shooting down of a plane by the Cuban regime that do not, they don't want any part of this because of the fact that there was no concessions made towards a, getting a democratized, government there. And this is what these people have been fighting for, and this is what these people are very upset at. But then you have, on the other side of the coin, people who are of the younger generation, and I'm talking from Arjuna, I'm talking about people like Brent Langel, I'm talking about other ones, who see this as a turning point for the United States and Western Hemisphere diplomacy. So, where do we draw a common ground, given the animosity on one side and the sympathy on the other? Where do we draw a common ground? Arjuna, I want to start with you on that.
Thanks, Bob. I'd like to, first of all, talk about Cuba itself in a localized way, give John a chance to speak, and then come back on how really we see it from Europe, which is from a longer perspective, and how we see it within what states do you recognize and have friendly relationships with, and what states you say are beyond the pale. But focusing on Cuba for a minute, my exposure to Cuba directly has been, I've got friends that have been to Cuba, I've seen plenty of movies about Cuba. There have been a few 007s, you see the glitzy side, there's the Michael Moore 2007 Sicko, and then I've also been quite involved with the permaculture movement, and it has been fascinating how with the collapse of the Soviet Union in around 1990, Cuba lost its cheap oil subsidies, and it actually has grown quite a successful, almost post-oil economy, where not by means of ideology or any specific commitment to organic, low-oil, sustainable agriculture, the Cubans have been forced into a very susustainable permaculture.
I want to interject one thing here, Arjuna, and then I'll let you continue. Is that we're seeing, we're hearing on the news, we're seeing that this is really indeed something that a lot of the people in Cuba, they're all dancing in the street, but you're talking here, we are still dealing with a very suppressing dictatorship, even though Raul Castro seems to be a little bit more lenient than his brother Fidel was. Are we still not, I guess you could say, negotiating with a dictator?
We always have negotiated with dictators.
Bob, let's you respond to this, and I'll come back. I've just spoken a bit, yeah?
We have always negotiated. Yeah, this is John here. We have in fact always negotiated with dictators. We have diplomatic relationships, for heaven's sakes, with Vietnam. One of you fought in Vietnam. I have friends who died in Vietnam, and yet the United States, for years and years now, has reestablished diplomatic relations. All this is about Florida in presidential elections. This is pandering to the older Cuban American crowd in Miami, in South Florida. And I get it. I understand it. But the question then becomes, do you really want one political party and its need for South Florida votes from the 1950s ideology to determine the future of foreign policy? Why not? Why not have the future of American foreign policy in the Americas take the tack that Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and Democratic presidents took, which is to engage with communist countries instead of saying, oh, we won't have anything to do with you until you magically transform from the inside. No, we transform them from engagement.
Okay, well, they're bringing up that. Okay, now you had brought about the fact of negotiating with dictators and with very suppressing governments. Okay, but then you come up to the fact that now we have another issue in that Cuba has been known to supply arms to North Korea, another very
okay, so this is part of the question you were asking me, Bob,
right,
about what about the wider picture.
Exactly.
And I think if you have to get that wider picture down to a single simple question, it's to what degree do you deal with repressive regimes? Yeah.
Well, in a sense, yes.
So if you say we stand for freedom, it's not like we stand for white people or we stand for Americans or anything like that. It's we stand or we stand for Latinos or we stand for whoever's like the so-and-so defined population of America. No, we stand for freedom, whatever your race, whatever your beliefs, so that your beliefs, so long as your beliefs are not wholesale slaughter of other people like the National Socialists. But basically we stand for freedom of expression, we stand for your First Amendment, and we stand for freedom. So if you're doing that, then you're going to rate other countries on freedom. I'd say that's not quite enough, because we have seen in Iraq that it's not just a matter of freedom versus unfree, it's also a matter of safe and organised versus chaotic. Like I asked somebody the other day, or this morning, would you rather live in Somalia, which is complete chaos, or North Korea? That person said, I would rather live in Somalia. You know, you wouldn't be guaranteed any safe existence in Somalia, but you would have the freedom of anarchy. So there is these two things in a matrix. But if you just look at freedom, human rights and political freedom, there's an organisation called Freedom House. I'm looking at their ratings of countries rather than Amnesty International, because it would seem that Amnesty International, it's like supposed great supporter of human rights worldwide, and it is in many cases, it's now accepted the now mainstream Muslim Brotherhood propaganda on Palestine, which is itself a very repressive regime. Amnesty International is talking about this as a representative and reasonable sort of government of Palestine, which, you know, is basically a terrorist group, Hamas. Although the EU is trying to unclassify it as so, but that's another connected story of the day. So I've done a small sort of rating, a tiny spreadsheet of this, and Cuba comes quite badly. It's like 6.5 out of 10, where 10 is the worst, or 9 is the worst. It's followed by China, Saudi Arabia, and North Korea. Better than Cuba in terms of human rights is Iran, surprisingly, on 6, and Russia on 5.5. Then there's your Moroccos and Pakistans, your Turkeys and Indonesia. After that, we don't have any Islam, and we don't have any communism, and India is about the worst significant country, which is considered free at 2.5. So really it's a matter of saying, we believe in freedom, and we're going to rate you and be friendly with you and consider alliances with you and trust with you on the basis of your rating. Let's just look at the list.
Yeah, but we're hearing though that, you know, even though we have this human rights issue that's there, you know, a lot of people, and Jonathan was very, very eloquent in what he said regarding the older generation of Cuban Americans who left Cuba, you know, simply because of how repressing their government was.
They desired freedom, they desired opportunity.
Right, yeah. well, let me finish. Let me finish here.
Yeah.
The fact that they came here, and it seems, and Jonathan, like I said, Jonathan was very eloquent in pointing this out, is that the Republican Party is indeed focusing on a dwindling population, and the younger generation are looking at Cuba differently, thanks to the internet, thanks to recent lifting of some sanctions to help people in Cuba. But we are also now hearing of some within the younger generation, including Marco Rubio and others, that not only want this these sanctions left in place, but they're under the misconception, and I'm going to say this, they're under the misconception these sanctions are working. Now, Jonathan, you and I grew up during this time.
Yeah, and you know what? You know what strikes me. You know who and you brought up the North Koreans. I'm going to bet that among the governments that are freaked out more than any other governments about this move, and most Americans wouldn't think about this, but I think it's the North Koreans. If there is cooperation now that helps the North Koreans from Cuba, the North Koreans, as of yesterday, have to know that the sunset is coming, because one of the things that the North Koreans hate us for more than anything, is the fact that we did open with China, and China has been more and more and more drawn into commerce and political negotiation with the West. And they are increasingly isolated, both intellectually, diplomatically, in terms of economic engagement. They can see now that we have picked off yet another one of their allies. Why the Republicans don't see the genius in doing this. And frankly, I'm delighted Obama did this, but my God, it should have been done decades ago.
Well, I agree. I think
you've got a really interesting point there, Jonathan, because I was thinking there about with Cuba and its culture. You know, it's preserved some non-Western culture in a nice way, with not having a Starbucks on every corner, not having a McDonald's on every corner. As I was saying, having developed quite a unique permaculture and a very successful healthcare system, despite the fact that it's a totalitarian communist regime. Now, look at China. They're total IP thieves. They take any software, they take any movie, they take any audio, anything at all. They even take Rolls-Royce motor cars and produce copies of them. Now, in one sense, you can say these guys are pirates in an economic sense, in an IP, intellectual property sense, and they are. On the other hand, how much chance do you have of enforcing a totalitarian communist ideology when your entire population of billions is freely copying that free Western culture? Because it's great, because it represents millions and billions of ideas. So if Cuba is now more open to its visitors from America and from Europe and from wherever else, it's going to be far more open to the myriad millions of ideas and the culture, free Western culture, which will transform the place.
Well,
so let's look at it positively.
Let me
if this were, think about it, guys, if this were, and I ask all of you out there in our audience to think about this, let's just suppose that this were 8 years from now, okay? And even more of the older Cuban generation in South Florida had gone the way of all flesh. They were gone. Do you think Marco Rubio would have for a moment stood up yesterday? This is all about Marco Rubio and his desire to be a vice president of the United States because he thinks he can convince the Republican Party that he can get South Florida votes. That is the most narrow, venal way. If this were 4 years or 8 years from now, with even more of those old Cuban Americans just gone. I mean, we're all going to be gone at some point. The world moves on. This is all about trying to strike while the iron is hot for 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 politicians. It is the most low and silly and infantile way to look at international policy that I can imagine. I was embarrassed as an American watching Rubio yesterday.
Jonathan, are you saying this is a bad thing, or it's just come about through silly little infantile reasons?
Oh no! I'm not saying that Marco Rubio doesn't have a past and that he doesn't hate the Castro brothers. Yes, he does. But I'm saying too that if this were 8 years from now, with his kind of constituent having died off in South Florida 4 and 8 years from now, even more, he wouldn't have bothered getting up yesterday.
Right.
This is all about his wanting to be on the next Republican ticket. It has nothing to do with a good, clear cold look at where we need to go as an international and national community.
Let me jump in here for a minute, because Jonathan, you raised something up earlier in reference to the fact of our ongoing negotiations and dealings with China. And you when you brought that up, and I'm kind of glad you did, is that China, used to be a staunch supporter, 100% supporter behind everything North Korea did. But now, being the fact that they are the Asian superpower, they are indeed pulling back on many things with North Korea. So my question is going to be this, and I want to bring it back to Cuba. Okay, I do want to bring it back to Cuba. Cuba also had very strong ties with Russia, and now given, even during the Cold War, after the Cold War, those two countries were still very, very close and allies. But now, given the fact that, guess what, we're going to have an embassy in Cuba, will that aspect of it cause Moscow to rethink what they are doing? Or do you think that, okay, so what? Cuba is allowing Americans there, but we're still going to be who we are. I want Jonathan, you first.
Oh, I think Putin, who is nobody's, no, he can't be anybody's model of a decent fellow. I think he is, you'll excuse the expression, pissing down his leg right now. He is very upset. He would love to have pretended that, well, they've still got some outpost in the Americas. No, he does not. Since Putin has gone adventurous into the Ukraine and made a whole bollocks of that, and now with this, the final loss of any outpost in the United States, his his fond memories of his life in the KGB, that's all he's got, fond memories. This is a coup. What Obama has pulled off yesterday is a coup, and it is a coup for the United States, for the Cuban people, and absolutely right, Bob Williams. I am so glad you brought that up. This is a coup against Moscow.
Arjuna, your comments.
I agree absolutely with Jonathan, because I was really looking at things very much on the perspective of culture, economy, human rights, and freedom. But this is something else that you have to consider. The USSR or Russia, whatever, it did have an outpost in Central America. It still has an ally. The president of Venezuela is still very pro-Russian, and there's lots of socialist sympathies in South America. But it's a definite pushing out from America. As I was saying, culturally, you can imagine when there's hundreds of thousands of visitors a year to Cuba, one hopes that it will retain to keep its USP, its unique charm, its beauty, and not get a Starbucks and a McDonald's on every corner.
Right.
But the good part of American culture, which is the freedom, the ability to think, the innovation, the technology, the wonder of Hollywood, the wonder of Silicon Valley, the wonder of the whole of America in its creativity and culture will permeate Cuba, such that by one means or another, freedom will be achieved through popular demand.
No, here's another aspect to this that I want to interject and get your opinions on. Marco Rubio, in his rant, and I'm going to leave it at that, in his rant brought up the fact of the United States has also denounced the human rights issue going on in Venezuela, and the government in Venezuela is not too kind on us either. Will what is going on in Cuba, because they are a part of the Latin American community, will what they see us doing in Cuba, is there a possibility and I'm going to leave it at that. Is there a possibility Venezuela and other countries like that are going to sit there and go, well, wait a minute, maybe we were a little bit too harsh, or do you think that they're going to tighten things up? Jonathan,
America is seen as the great Satan because it is the epitome of the most successful model of Western democracy, or it was in the 20th century. It's had its troubles in the noughties, as has the rest of the West, as has the world with financial shenanigans. But really, it's seen as one of the pinnacles of Western civilization. So if you are trying to get popular support for your socialist ideals, or indeed your Islamic ideals, you have some bone of contention with Western democracy, then clearly that is going to focus on the United States. So when the United States shows that it can act as a good neighbor with Cuba, and let's hope that Cuba and and America will both be good neighbors, better neighbors in the future with each other, and especially one hopes with the transfer of peoples visiting the two different places, that this will foment friendly relations, freedom, let's be optimistic, and this will influence Venezuela.
I think it will.
If not the government, the people of Venezuela, which is ultimately and eventually, we hope, reflected in the government.
Oh, I think it will, and I also would be very happy to make the bet, if it could ever be found out if I were to be right. I would make a bet that within hours either before or after Raul Castro went on his television yesterday, he was on the phone with numbers of his fellow leaders in South and Central America and in the Caribbean saying, you know what, folks, my friend, leader of Venezuela, some interesting things are coming, and I think you better get on board. The problem with Americans sometimes is we think, oh, they're going to get on board. You see, no, they're not. They haven't all of a sudden been hailing us as if we're Jesus marching into Jerusalem, riding into Jerusalem on the white donkey. They're not hailing us. They're not waving palm fronds at us. These things take time, people. These things take time. It took time for these negotiations with Cuba. I mean, but I'm going to be willing to say that if Raul Castro has half a brain, he was on the phone for a few days talking in this past week with people who are his counterparts in the more socialist inclined capitals that he's done business with, and he's probably saying to them, look, I know it's going to take time. You may not like this. You may have some PR problems coming out of this. But you know what, folks? This is the answer to our economic problems.
Okay, now I have one other question I want to pose out there. Globally, President Obama has been taking a lot of hits in reference to his foreign policy. A lot of people have said that he has no backbone.
What foreign policy? I don't see any.
Okay, all right, that's what I'm talking about there, Arjuna. But given what has now happened with Cuba, will it change people's impression that, hey, this guy does have a foreign policy, he does have an agenda, or are we still going to see the cynicism and the the bashing, from around the globe, that he still has no ability to
I think if it works, then it may well be the best thing he's ever done. But you've got to look at it, is it a glass half full? You're an optimist, or a glass half empty, the pessimist. The optimist, the glass half full, as I've been saying here, will say it's an opportunity for freedom and a freedom of culture, which will hopefully not, take over and obliterate Cuban culture, but enrich it in a good way with tourists, with money to spend, and increase the average income of the Cubans. This will be a good thing, and Americans and other visitors can bring back all the happiness and good culture of Cuba. Looking at the glass half empty, the danger is that America's been saying to Cuba for the past 50 years, you are a totalitarian communist regime, we're not going to do business with you. Now it's saying, well, I don't know whether it's saying you've lightened up a bit or you're still as bad, but we are going to do business with you. So the danger, the glass half empty side of things, is for America to continue to be seen under Obama, as it has been for the past 6 years, as weak. Because when it comes to dealing with other totalitarian regimes, such as North Korea, where Sony have just withdrawn a motion picture called The Interview about the assassination of the guy, Saudi Arabia, where Obama bows down to King Saud, Iran, where the United States and other Western allies seem to be pussyfooting around this idea of nuclear weapons control. It's all part of a portfolio of weakness, and that is the dangerous glass half empty part at the side of the coin. Well, if I'm mixing metaphors there, but this is the downside. We all hope that this will bring about greater freedom in Cuba, and that's the upside. The downside is, it is, like it or not, no two ways about it, in some ways, yet another manifestation of America under Obama showing extreme weakness.
Now, Jonathan, your impressions on that?
No, I for all sorts of reasons that we don't need to get into, I wholly disagree with my friend Arjuna on that assessment. I think that the problem that we have here, and answering your question directly, Bob, is this. Americans tend to like pounding chest executives, and Obama is not one. It's not his personality. He works behind the scenes, and then he makes announcements and he surprises people. He does not go into the "we will bury you" kind of rhetoric. He's not interested in that. It's just not who he is as a human being. It's not who he is as a man. I think that whether it's Iran, whether it's Cuba, I think he will be shown to have been right. I think the dancing in the streets in Havana yesterday, and there was a hell of a lot of that too in Miami, we do not need people in our executive offices in D.C. who pound their chest and make bully statements. You know what? That got us into this idiot war in Afghanistan and in Iraq that has done absolutely nothing for us. If people want to continue to think that what leadership is this bellicose, we're going to pound the crap out of you rhetoric, if that's what leadership is, well, go for it. But what it has gotten us is nothing.
Well, I agree in part to what both of you are saying. Number one, the fact that, Jonathan, you brought it up, is our policy prior to President Obama coming into office was beat our chests, go get them, John Wayne style, and all that. And the fact that, we do need to have that olive branch, and I want to put it that way, that we are giving it, currently extending it to Cuba.
Yeah. I think what Jonathan was saying was, he was saying he agrees with the glass half full side of what I was saying, but not the glass half empty. I was saying there's two sides to this. And I think one of the best ways that you can look at this reconciliation between the US and Cuba, it's if you look at it, in terms of Florida attaining friendly relations with Cuba, say they're of roughly similar size, you could look at it in similar way to the reunification of East and West Germany. I mean, at the time, it was seen as a fantastic thing. Germany was reunited, and it was a democratic, modern 20th century free Germany.
No, Arjuna, I think that's a terrific analogy.
Okay.
Thank you. But it has given rise to a European Union which has been steadily more and more influenced by communism. So that's what I mean by looking at it from both sides. Okay, in East Germany now, which is all part of Greater Germany, it is a free country. It's part of the EU. It has the same human rights record as the United States, Australia, or anywhere else. On the other hand, we do have this influence, which has partly come through Angela Merkel herself, an East German, to the EU, which is now a very dangerous totalitarian communist bloc itself.
Now, Jonathan, you were going to say something, Jonathan?
Oh no! Only that I think that the fact that when we helped East and West Germany combine, it was a lot more than tear down that wall, Mr. Gorbachev. And yes, I think Reagan should have said that, and he did. But we also did a lot of things behind the scenes that were not bully pulpit, that were not bellicose. We helped get those two nations together economically, and Arjuna's correct that the EU, for its ups and downs, could not have existed with two different Germanys. It had to be one Germany. I think that with Cuba, you have to base policy in effect on that glass half full. Otherwise, you never have the chance to progress. It is the problem with Americans that I see is that
there's a big problem there, Jonathan. Please let me get you on that point. You're saying you have to base foreign policy and relations with other countries on the glass half full side of things. But if you look at Pakistan, it has a human rights record. I was saying earlier, the Freedom House gives it a human rights record of 4.5 compared with Cuba's 6.5. So Freedom House considers Pakistan a fair degree freer than Cuba. Pakistan is nominally the ally of the US and the West, and yet it incubated bin Laden. It's incubated Al-Qaeda ever since 2001, when Al-Qaeda was driven out of the arms of the Taliban.
But all
Pakistan is in no way, shape or form an ally, so you cannot simply look through rose-tinted spectacles.
All I'm saying, guys, is that had we not seen the optimistic possibilities, we would still be virtually, and we might have already had a war with China, who has, by the way, a 5 million member standing army.
Well, the thing now, I don't mean to interrupt here, because we are kind of.
I think it's working well with a few interruptions, actually, Bob.
Yeah. It's just that I want to kind of bring everything back here to the Cuban situation. And granted, there's going to be. I'm not going to deny it. There's going to be a global ripple effect from what happened yesterday. But we are hearing here in the States, and I'm sure Jonathan will vouch for this. We are hearing potential presidential candidates that coming out of the woodwork in condemnation of this. You've got, of course, Marco Rubio. You've got Ted Cruz. You've got Jeb Bush. We haven't heard from the Christie side of it, but I'm almost certain he's going to come out against it as well. But what we haven't heard...
I think anyone who's dead certain one way or another is wrong. It's nuanced. There's possibilities. It could go either way.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to get at here is we haven't heard from too many people, either on the Senate or in the House, that are in favor of this, other than Senator Leary, who actually went to Cuba, and reporters, basically mainstream media, who were reporting there's dancing in the streets in Cuba and there's dancing in the streets in Miami about this. But the problem is the geopolitical aspect of what is going on and went on behind the scenes is going to have repercussions.
Okay, so you're saying what's going to go on? Can I think a little outside the box here and say, look, when you're looking at the future, you can look at it in two ways. You can go and ask an astrologer what is going to happen, and you can get your magic cookie and your prediction and your tea leaves, and you say, oh, so that's going to happen. They have great wisdom. Or you can go out and say, screw the astrologers. This could happen, or that could happen. I'm going to make this happen. So the mark of a true leader, if Obama was a leader or whatever other leaders we have, and they can be a person who's simply a musician, a poet. It's down to every one of us. We can go visit Cuba as a musician or a poet or just as a tourist who talks to people. We can take whatever leadership abilities we have as being a citizen in the world and say, well, I'm going to make this happen, not that. I'm going to resist communist influence of America. I am going to resist tolerance of totalitarianism, and I'm going to go out there and put out my ideas, his ideas, her ideas, that I like this music and that music, and go out and say, we have an opportunity here, we have a bridge, we're coming over the bridge, you're not coming over the bridge. I don't mean Cubans can't visit America. I mean Americans, who are the closest, they're a lot closer than we are in Europe, although I've had friends who've visited Cuba. We're going to go out there and we're going to be free. We're going to refuse to accept your restrictions on free speech. We're going to give you our culture, and we're going to love yours where it's great, like the Cuban music, the Cuban permaculture, everything.
Let me say this. I think that people need to remember that yesterday, on this news, the stock market went up. The Dow went up over about 300 points. Don't people understand that once American businesses are allowed back into Cuba, and it will happen within 3 to 5 years, I will bet my life on it, that we will have a full, interesting, dicey but solid commerce back and forth, and bringing the Cuban people back into the modern economy. That in itself helps predict that the glass half full.
That's a good point, Jonathan.
Well, yeah, Jonathan brought up a very good point there. Regarding the Dow, it did indeed go up.
Yeah.
After the
we hear a
announcement.
lot of bad things about multinational corporations.
A lot
of multinational corporations are responsible for a lot of ecological degradation and a lot of financial shenanigans, but they're also responsible. The countries where they operate don't tend to go to war against each other.
Well, let me finish what I was going to say here, Arjuna.
Sorry.
Please. Okay, like I said, number one, the Dow did go up, as Jonathan was so correct to point out. A lot of businesses, the telecommunications business, other businesses are already gearing up for the potential of going into Cuba and doing commerce, which in itself will add vital money into their economy. But here's the but. You are still dealing with a dictatorship that nothing is going to get done unless their pockets are lined first. So in essence, what Marco Rubio and all these other ones are saying is, granted, we may, Obama may have allowed this to happen, but we're in control, and we're going to be in control of the House. We're going to be in control of the Senate. We're going to block any potential of any ambassador going down there. We're going to block opening up this embassy. Then isn't everything that happened yesterday for naught? Jonathan?
Oh, I don't think so. I think that the business end, the enterprise end of the Republican Party, let's say the Jeb Bush end, for want of a better phrase. Of course Jeb Bush says, oh, this is not a good idea, but of course he knows it's a good idea. He has to say that. He wants that party's nomination, so he's going to say that now, and you can watch in the next 6 months, if he actually runs, he'll backpedal a little bit and backpedal a little bit. You can mark my word. The point is, the business end of what used to be called the Northeast part of the Republican Party will have its say, not just these cultural radical part of the Republican Party who you hear from whenever Obama sneezes. The point is, they will be saying to their people, whether it's the Koch brothers or whether it's the old line Northeast Republicans, this is good for the Dow. get an ambassador in there. It may not happen the first time there's a vote and people will go, oh no, you see, stuck it to Obama. But of course, there will be an ambassador to Cuba, because it is in the interests of the American business community to have one.
Yeah. So Bob, I think if you're asking, is this a good thing? Is the Dow right? Then I think that with everyone's efforts, it will be. Yes. It comes back to what I was saying earlier. You can assess a country on whether it's free or unfree, and America's bone with Cuba for the past half century has been that it is unfree. It is a communist state. However, we also have to look at the other thing, which is not always put into words, and that is a country safe and organized, or is it chaos on earth? Is it a failed state? I wouldn't have any problems at all with going and working in Cuba. I would realize that it is basically a kingdom. In what way are the Castro brothers different from monarchy? None really that I can see of, except they hide behind this pretense called communism. It's very little different from feudalism. It's a kingdom. They are the kings. And I'm not saying that necessarily in a pejorative way. There are kingdoms that function. There are kingdoms that are a lot better than the imposed democracies that follow them, that tend to descend into complete chaos. So I'll say, okay, if this is a Castro kingdom, it functions. People have reasonable life expectancy. People have the opportunity to do most of the things that people want to do. Their human needs are met. It's not as good as a completely free, a completely safe country, but it's better than some others.
Okay,
and that's where we need to look at the numbers.
We've got about 60 seconds left, and I want to give you each a couple moments here. And so the final question I have for everyone is this: is in 5 years, 10 years from now, are we going to see the Castro regime staying so solid to the ongoing beliefs of communism, or are we going to see them, their beliefs chip away and a more democratic society coming into Cuba? Each of you got 30 seconds, and we'll start out with Arjuna.
Okay, thanks, Bob. I have a hope, I'd put it like that as the Castros age, that there will be a blossoming of, call it local Soviets, if you like. The word Soviet means a workers' committee, such that we get a blossoming of local, partial democracy in balance with what is essentially their kingdom. Let's see an improvement, and let's hope that this has been a major part of that coming about.
Jonathan.
I agree with that. I think within 5 to 10 years you're going to see slow but steady engagement and improvement, and the notion of engagement is democratizing.
All right, guys, I'm going to have you guys all hang on here with me for a few minutes. Everybody else, what can I say? Yep, time for me to get out of here. Stay tuned, because coming up right after NPR News, Ed Till will be with you all the way up until 4 o'clock. Until tomorrow, 6 a.m., this is Bob Williams. Take care of yourselves.